evening. Hello, good evening. Thank you. I'm Ann Colello, and I teach here at Clark University. On behalf of Clark's Society, Culture, and Discourse Department, and on behalf of the Clark community, I welcome you to this presentation about the Slave Dwelling Project by Mr. Joseph McGill. Mr. McGill resides in South Carolina, and I was fortunate enough to meet him in December as my family toured Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston. Joe's presentation at the site of the slave dwellings located on that plantation's grounds moved me in ways that are difficult to express. As a result, I approached him after his presentation and shared with him some experiences I've had over the past 3 decades when teaching Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. These are Jacobs' own words from chapter 30, The Loophole of Retreat. These are the words that she used to describe the living conditions under which she chose to live for nearly 7 years. Living conditions she chose rather than endure abuse from the man who owned her. A small shed had been added to my grandmother's house years ago. Some boards were laid across the joists at the top, and between these boards and the roof was a very small garret, never occupied by anything but rats and mice. It was a pent roof covered with nothing but shingles. The garret was only 9 feet long and 7 wide. The highest part was 3 feet high and sloped down abruptly to the loose board floor. There was no admission for either light or air. The air was stifling, the darkness total. I could sleep quite comfortably on one side, but the slope was so sudden that I could not turn on the other without hitting the room. The rats and mice ran over my bed. In my small den, day and night were all the same. I suffered for air even more than for light. There was no hole, no crack through which I could peep. It seemed horrible to sit or lie in a cramped position day after day without one gleam of light. Yet, I would have chosen this rather than my lot as a slave, though white people considered it an easy one. And it was, so compared with the fates of others. I was never cruelly overworked. I was never lacerated with the whip from head to foot. I was never so beaten and bruised that I could not turn from one side to the other. I never had my heel strings cut to prevent my running away. I was never chained to a log and forced to drag it about while I toiled in the fields from morning till night. I was never branded with hot iron or torn by bloodhounds. On the contrary, I had always been kindly treated and tenderly cared for until I came into the hands of Dr. Flint. I had never wished for freedom till then. It was impossible for me to move in an erect position, but I crawled about my den for exercise. For weeks, I was tormented by hundreds of little red insects, fine as a needle's point, that pierced through my skin and produced an intolerable burning. The heat of my den was intense, for nothing but thin shingles protected me from the scorching summer's sun. But I had my consolation. Through my peeping hole, I could watch my children. And when they were near enough, I could hear their talk. When winter came, the cold penetrated through the thin shingle roof, and I was dreadfully chilled. Often, I was obliged to lie in bed all day to keep comfortable. But with all my precautions, my shoulders and feet were frostbitten. This description is impactful. One of my students shared with me just how much it impacted her. She went home from class and set up one part of the bedroom that she shared with her husband, to mimic the description of Jacob's chosen dwelling of 7 years. She slept in the space that night and wept most of the night and most of the next day. She felt Jacob's experience and shared that with her classmates. I shared this with Joe, and soon after, I asked him if he would ever consider speaking at Clark University in Iowa. He jokingly responded that he would not visit Iowa during the winter because he knew Iowa winters firsthand from the time that he spent in Cedar Rapids at the African American Museum. We laughed and agreed to keep in touch. I'm grateful that further communication between the two of us led to him visiting our campus today. Joe's years as a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and his experiences as the executive director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and his experiences as the director of history and culture at Penn Center in St. Helena Island, South Carolina, the first school built during the Civil War for the education of recently freed enslaved people, richly enhanced the information that he will share with us tonight. Tonight's presentation, which will be followed by a question and a response period, is about the Slave Dwelling Project, an organization that Joe founded. According to the organization's website, the Slave Dwelling Project envisions a future in which the hearts and minds of United Statesians acknowledge a more truthful and inclusive narrative of the history of the nation that honors the contributions of all our people, is embedded and preserved in the buildings and artifacts of people of African heritage, and inspires all United Statesians to acknowledge their ancestors. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph McGill to Dubuque and the Clark community, and in thanking him for traveling to be with us today. Joe.
So you got vibes. All right. United Statesian. That's a word. That's a word. Yeah, English major. Huh? Yes. English. Yeah. I'm an English major also. So I appreciate that. I got to do this. Guys. All right. Okay. And then this. All right. Beautiful. I got to do these things. I got to document what I do, where I go, because I gotta prove to my boss, who gave me the time off to do this, to let her know that I am doing what I said I was going to do, and you're the proof of all that. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, the Slave Dwelling Project. It's a concept that I came up with about 12 years ago. First of all, let me grab this, make sure I can advance the slides when I need to. But it's a concept that I came up with about 12 years ago because, I was a little angry, I was a little mad, because I would go to places, historic sites that once enslaved people, and I would hear about the nice, beautiful, architecturally significant big houses that marketers use to get the people to come to these places. And I would go there and I would admire the places, and I would take in all that they offered, all the information that they disseminated. But the information that they disseminated was about the people who inhabited the spaces, those nice, beautiful big houses. They talked about the place settings, the vaulted ceilings, the grand staircases. And it was a good story to take in, but what I learned was that it was not the whole story. Because I had the pleasure, even before going to some of these places, of being a Civil War reenactor. In being a Civil War reenactor, I would go to sites, historic battlefields where Civil War battles took place. And at these Civil War battles, as we would reenact these battles, we would, after the activity is done, night begins to fall, we have these campfires, and we would have conversations. We have conversations about what our thoughts were about that war, that Civil War. And some of the things that I heard about what people believed that war was, it was not aligning with my thoughts. It was some of the things that I learned in school. And the things I learned in school was not right either. Because as I sat in class and was learning the history of these United States, what they were telling me was that the enslaved people were happy, that the enslavers were benevolent. And I believed it because I was a young kid. It was my teachers. You have to believe your teachers because, they have the knowledge. They bring the knowledge to you. They teach you the things that you're supposed to learn. But then, I graduated. I went into the United States military, spent 6 years in the United States military, in the Air Force. And then I got out and I went to South Carolina State University, majored in English, and learned history in college. And again, they weren't teaching me the things, some of the things that I'm going to share with you tonight. It was not until I became a park ranger at Fort Sumter, where the Civil War started, that I started to do my own research as to the history of these United States. And then I started learning that some of the things that I was taught was not right. It was not aligning with the greatness of this nation. Yeah, this is a great nation. But along the way, we committed some atrocities. And it's those atrocities that were not being disseminated to me. And I thought that this slave dwelling project was an opportunity to right some of that wrong. So let's go on this journey that I'm now on. All right. So check that out. That's Belle Grove Plantation in Middletown, Virginia. Slave dwelling project. Again, as was explained, a very simple concept. Find slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States. Ask the owners if I could spend the night in these spaces, to bring attention to these spaces, to let the world know that, yes, these places are beautiful. How could one not be enamored by all this? How could one not have the desire to go and explore a place like that? And the excitement is there in just the architectural significance of this building. But you got to think about this. You got to think about who built that, who physically built it. Now, I'm not saying that enslaved people were the architects, because we were not. But who physically built that? That place is made of quarried rocks or stones. Who was in that quarry pulling those stones out of there? Who was shaping those stones? Now, use that same concept. If this building, there's trees involved. Somebody had to cut down some trees to frame this building. who put those marks in those beams? Or if this building was made of bricks, who made those bricks? Whose labor was stolen for all of this to exist? Those questions were not being answered in the information that was being disseminated at these places. It was not in the marketing that got these people to come to view such a place. And that's the thing that was upsetting to me. And when you get upset, or when you get pissed, or when you get angry, you got choices. You could do things with that anger. You could use it for good, or you could use it for evil. So I thought this idea that I had of spending a night in these spaces, just to bring attention to the fact that these places exist, was a good idea. So it's another thing that set me off. I don't know if you can read that, but it talks about happy slaves. It talks about benevolent slave owner. That is a Virginia history book that you're looking at there. And that's what people were learning about slavery in the state of Virginia. Now, it's Virginia because that's the book I had access to. But think about all the other states teaching this same thing. Me being in South Carolina, learning this history, sitting in class and being told that my enslaved ancestors were happy to be enslaved, that the people enslaving them were good to them, or the enslavers were benevolent. That's the thing that's my inspiration to do what I do, to take on this task that I've been taking on for the last 12 years, to counter this. So that's Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. That's where I currently work. That's where I met you. Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. You stepped into that place. So this place was my inspiration. I was lucky to be one of the inspectors when the work was being done to bring this place online. They called in a group of experts, and I was considered such, and they called me in to be a part of this team. And we were inspecting the work that was being done to restore these places. And because I was one of the ones that was called in and was inspecting this work, I said out loud, I said, look, when the work here is done, maybe I could spend the night in this space. And somebody heard it. Somebody heard it that took it up the chain of command. And somebody up in the chain of command thought it was a good idea. And because they thought it was a good idea, then I acquired a list from the State Historic Preservation Office in South Carolina. And on that list, of course, me explaining to them my intent, they understood. We were thinking some of the same thoughts, and those thoughts was about preservation and making sure that these buildings stay on the landscape. So I got that list, and I started making phone calls. And I got a lot of yeses, because they got it. Now, it was a little challenging for some, because if you were on the other end of a phone call of a person making such a request to come to your site and spend the night in a slave dwelling, you gotta wonder, well, what is this person all about? Is he about reparations? Is he about looking for ghosts? Is he looking for treasures? Well, none of the above. It's about preserving these places to ensure that the stories of the people who inhabited these spaces is told and told correctly. Now, one thing that I didn't cover at the beginning of this presentation, I was lucky enough when I was in the military. I went to Amsterdam, and I went into the place where Anne Frank hid from the Germans. That did something to me. That made me realize that spaces like this need to exist. Although everything associated with these spaces is not positive, they still need to exist. Because when I was in that space where Anne Frank hid from those Germans, I thought about my time in high school, in my history class, and me being the person that I knew I was back then, and not being that as attentive as I needed to be to learn what my teacher was trying to teach me, I went into that space. It all came back rushing back to me. And it meant something then because I was in that space. So that also helped me to create this idea of the Slave Dwelling Project. This site right here, presidential site, Montpelier, Orange, Virginia. We the people, James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Yeah, that's where that is right there. Now, if you look at that building, you would say, oh, I don't think so. I don't think that's the president's house. And I put that picture up there purposely because I wanted to focus on those slave dwellings. Because more recently, archaeologists, preservationists, historians, archivists, they found the evidence of the existence of enslaved people. And they used that archaeological evidence and that archival material to recreate what the slave dwellings look like at that site. So now if you were to visit Montpelier, as you walk towards that nice, beautiful, architecturally significant house, in your right periphery, you cannot help but see those slave dwellings. So now it's right there prominently where it needs to be, to let you know that, yeah, president, yes, father of the Constitution, yes, but that we, the people, did not include these folks, because that same Constitution had to be amended many times to include these folks. So I think it's good that Montpelier is doing the right thing. Now, those of you who might be in the know, you may know that Montpelier went through some turmoil recently because they wanted so much to do the right thing, and they verbally said, we're going to do the right thing by putting descendants of enslaved people on our board of directors to help govern this place. It sounded good on paper. It looked good. But then they implemented that process. And they thought that they were getting folks who were just going to sit by and just be wallpaper or just sit there to be on the board. But these people were quite vocal. These descendants of these enslaved people were quite vocal in the governing of this place. So they tried to renege. They tried to pull back on that promise. And it played itself out in public. Those folks who were raising a stink about putting the descendants of enslaved people had to retract and make good on that promise. So now they're in a better place. So I could use them as an example of what to do at sites like this now. So there's my kit right there. That's Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky. That's how simply I do this thing. Find these slave dwellings, ask these owners if I can sleep in there, bring my sleep. If I'm driving, I bring my padding, my sleeping bag, and my pillow. If I'm flying, I ask my host to provide these things. Just last week, I was in Maryland, Prince George's County, Maryland, a place called Rosedale. I was there. Marietta was the year before. Marietta was the site of a Supreme Court justice. You know, in this journey that I've been on, I've stayed at the home of 2 Supreme Court justices. One was in, I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I know I got a slide on that. But that's my kit right there. Very simple. The Hermitage, Nashville, Tennessee. You know, I got this trick question that I ask people. Sometimes when oftentimes when I'm at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, I'm about to address my audience, I will ask them the question, how many of you have visited a plantation? And a large percentage of that audience will raise their hand. They said, oh, this is my first time. This is my first time at a plantation. And then I reveal to them that it's a trick question. And then I ask them the same question another way. I said, well, how many of you have visited the Hermitage? Or how many of you have visited Montpelier, Monticello, or Mount Vernon? And those folks will say, yeah, I visited those places. I said, well, yeah, then you visited a plantation. I said, you know, somebody in the existence of these places, in the attempt to bring them online for people to come visit these places, made it their business not to call those places plantations. That's because 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, 8 of whom owned slaves while they were in office. And we repeatedly lull ourselves to sleep or fool ourselves by making the impression that we were not this nation. We were always this nation. And of course, that's the home of President Andrew Jackson, also known for the Trail of Tears. There it is. Chief Justice John Jay, New York. Now, another amazing thing about this project, when I started 12 years ago, I was very limited in my way of thinking because my education put me in that place. Education made me put slavery in a plantation in the South, and that's just where it stayed. But thinking that way, I was too limited in my way of thinking. One thing that Ann has taught me, sorry, I got to call you Ann, we're just friends like that now. She has taught me that my thinking is too limited. So what I found out was right here. I had this slavery thing relegated to plantations in the South, and even thinking about plantations in the South, right there in Charleston, South Carolina, I was missing a whole lot because I was not thinking about urban slavery. You know, that for all of you who have visited Charleston, South Carolina, there was probably some marketing put out there to get you there. And I'm certain that in that marketing, they didn't talk about slavery. They didn't talk about those nice, beautiful houses that front the streets, those antebellum houses that front the street that people so admire. They didn't talk about the fact that behind those nice, beautiful antebellum houses are the slave dwellings. They didn't talk about that. So I was missing all that in what I learned about slavery. And I was certainly missing slavery in northern states. Slavery in New York ended in 1799 on paper, but it was prolonged. Last person freed in New York was 1827. In 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. When South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th of 1860, New York, for a brief moment, considered seceding also because of their financial investment in the institution of slavery. So Justice John Jay, Supreme Court, he was instrumental in ending slavery in the state of New York. But while he was advocating for freeing enslaved people in the whole state of New York, he was enslaving people. Kind of like Thomas Jefferson. You know, all men are created equal. Well, he owned about 600 people. Of course, there's a Sally Hemings story. So, the Slave Dwelling Project, this very simple idea that I came up with, it has evolved. A lot of people stand in line for the opportunity to sleep with me in these places. But it's more than that now. The sleeping part is easy. That's easy. Anybody could do that. Anybody who could muster the courage to come to such a site and sleep at a site, that's the easy part. But now, before we go to sleep, we sit around and we have these conversations. We have these conversations about things that people don't usually talk about with people who don't look like them or think like them. We talk about the death of George Floyd, white supremacy, white privilege, historical trauma. When I talk about historical trauma, I'm referring to things like, why is it that black folks don't have a desire to visit plantations? Why is it that black folks can see that there's a problem having weddings at plantations and white folks can't? That's historical trauma because of all these things that happen at these sites. So now we sit around and we have these conversations. This group here to the left, that's a group from Wisconsin, a Jesuit school called Marquette University High School. Jesuits, let me tell you one story right quick about Jesuits. Georgetown University, once upon a time in their history, they almost went under. They needed money, and they needed money desperately. So here's how they got their money. The trustees donated enslaved people to be sold. And those enslaved people were sold to Louisiana. And that's what kept that school afloat. I know some of the descendants of those people who were sold. Now, to make it right, they're offering scholarships, partial scholarships to the descendants of those enslaved people. So they're doing something to try to make it right. Call it reparations, call it what you want. But if you use that word reparations, people are going to look at you funny, because they're going to start going into their own separate corners and they're going to argue about reparations, and that's another matter. But that place right there. So I meet this school group someplace in the United States every year. And this particular time is in Maryland. That's Kennedy Farm. And for those of you who might be familiar with John Brown and Harper's Ferry, that's the place John Brown stayed the night before that raid on Harper's Ferry. So we sit around and we have conversations about that particular site. I also met that group at a place called Bacon's Castle in Virginia, and we talked about Nat Turner and Nat Turner's raid, and we talked about, would you have been in Nat Turner's camp? And I said, yes, I would have been right there, right beside Nat Turner, going from plantation to plantation in a revolt. Right there to the right, that's Belle Grove again. That first photograph that I showed you, that's one of the first places that I've gone where we can cook in the authentic hearth, in that same room where we are now. We're having one of those conversations. And that might be the place where I learned from a young lady in the group. Some of you may have heard the name Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof was the young man, I guess I can call him a young man, who went into the church in Charleston, South Carolina, and took out 9 lives. In that conversation, I learned from one of the participants in the conversation that her brother was mimicking the actions of Dylan Roof. In other words, he was accessing those websites that Dylan Roof was accessing. He was enthralled by guns. He had many guns. Now, I haven't heard anything coming out of that area about a similar incident, and that's a great thing. But here's my point. We have these conversations around these campfires. Right there to the left, that's Connecticut. That is New London, Connecticut. For the past 4, 5, 6 years, I've been going to New London, Connecticut to celebrate Juneteenth. Juneteenth was, of course, in June 19th of 1865 is when those federal forces went into Galveston, Texas, and let those enslaved people know that they were indeed free. Because when the Emancipation Proclamation was put forth in January of 1863, it really meant nothing if there were not any federal forces around to enforce it. So for Galveston, Texas, it was June 19th of 1865. So again, I've gone to New London, Connecticut. We stayed in the Hempstead houses in Connecticut. Slavery ended in Connecticut in 1848. Right there to the right, there's that site near Harper's Ferry there where John Brown went and he took some enslaved people as collateral, if you will. He kind of said, you can come with us you kicking, or you can come with us screaming. He took them away screaming, but he took the enslaved people away with him. Of course, the owners weren't very happy about that, but that's what John Brown did. Again, slave dwellings as classrooms. That place right there in the background there to the left, that's where I work. That's Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. An amazing thing about that particular cabin, my very first night in a slave cabin, as this project exists right now, I woke up that morning, Mother's Day of 2010. I woke up not being familiar with the property, took a walk, not knowing where I was going. And I ended up in the cemetery where the enslaved people are buried. And I saw some modern headstones. Then I saw some headstones of some people who were born enslaved and died free. And then I saw indentions in the earth. There were unmarked graves. And what I found out was, if you were born enslaved and died enslaved, your graves were not marked. You know, it may have been marked by something at the time of your death when they buried you. They may have put something there. And so when I'm at Magnolia Plantation, we'll say, what? They say, well, why aren't these graves marked? I said, because they were uneducated. It was illegal for them to be educated. A headstone denotes something you have to write on. And of course, those enslavers were not going to provide a headstone for people whose labor they had stolen for all their lives. So that's why the graves are unmarked. And you know, that's a lesson. So now if you go there, if you come upon one such a place, a cemetery that's unmarked, and if you know it's a cemetery, you got to look for those indentions in the earth. That is, if they were lucky enough to have been buried in a box. That box would eventually give way. The earth on top would conform. And that's how you find some of those graves. It's kind of like me looking at brick walls right now, looking for those telltale signs of the existence of enslaved people. You know, you take that place there to the right, for instance, that is Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky. My first stay in Kentucky. It's very hard for me to get into the state of Kentucky. It took years to do that. Lucky, Kentucky was a breeding state, meaning that, you know, up until 1808, it was illegal. I mean, it was, I said that wrong. Up until 1808, it was legal. It was legal to import people into this nation for the purpose of enslaving them. Because if you go back to 1787, when we were in Philadelphia at our nation's capital, those Southerners wanted to, count the enslaved people as one whole. The Northerners said, well, if you want to count them as such for congressional representation, then you count them as 3/5. So that's where that 3/5 thing came from. But so we're around having this conversation about enslaved people and the fact that they are not well documented. I said, well, yes, they are documented. Because if you look at the censuses of those period, you will see that they're enumerated. And they're enumerated for the purpose of congressional representation. They won't put their names, although all they had was a first name. They didn't put that on census documents, but they put a gender, a race, and an age because of congressional representation. You will also find them in tax documents because they had to pay taxes on them. They're property, and they were treated as such. So people often tell me, well, we don't interpret them because, first of all, we have no buildings that they inhabited, and we have no records of their existence. Yes, you do. If you can tell stories from the documents that you had about the enslavers, then in those same documents, you can find evidence of the existence of enslaved people through the taxes, through the congressional representation, through those letters that they wrote. Maybe they talked about having to punish an enslaved person, or having to buy another enslaved person, or have to sell a family member to make ends meet. That stuff is there. We just gotta look at the same information differently and pull that stuff out there. So at Locust Grove, we're having this conversation around the campfire, and these conversations usually last about 2 hours. So here we are in the third hour. the conversation is still going strong. And so that's the power of what we do with this project. There was a situation at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and we're sitting around the campfire with the descendants of Sally Hemings and others who were enslaved at Monticello. And it almost came to blows. We almost got into a fist fight. Well, not me. Two other people around the campfire having that conversation almost got into a fist fight because there was a faction of folks who wanted to believe that it was a consensual relationship. And they're the others. Now keep in mind, Sally Hemings at the time was only 14. And she was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife. Now, the wife was long dead when Thomas Jefferson was carrying on this relationship with Sally Hemings. So though, other time, we almost had a fist fight. New Orleans, alcohol involved. We're sitting around the campfire talking about free labor. And we call it free labor because the enslaved people were not getting paid. But this one gentleman, not that he objected, because in his mind it was free, but in his mind it wasn't. He brought up the fact that, well, it wasn't free because the enslaver was providing them housing, food, and clothing. He wasn't wrong. His timing was just off. And another time we almost got into a fist fight just because he expressed himself that way. So another thing that we do in this evolution of this idea that was born right here in this cranium, living history. So what I found out is that I'm very limited in what I'm capable of doing. I'm not an avid reader. Don't accuse me as such, or don't try to praise me for being that, because I'm not. I found out that I'm very limited. So in my limited abilities, I like doing what I'm doing right now. I'm hanging out with you guys, and I feel comfortable up here doing this. But living history, that's something else. What I also found out when you visit such sites like that, once upon a time you could go to sites like this and you could see things being demonstrated with people in period clothing, white people in period clothing, demonstrating cooking and brick making and blacksmithing and barrel making and whatever the enslaved people would have been doing at these sites. I said, well, wait a minute, that's not right. White folks would not have been doing that in that period in our history. So that sparked the idea of living history. And I call it kind of Colonial Williamsburg on wheels. To get that kind of activity, you have to go physically to Colonial Williamsburg. So what the living history does, it brings it to the public. It brings it to them. So if someone wants to engage the Slave Dwelling Project at their site, I give them this list of living historians that are under our employ, and they could choose from this list. It's kind of an a la carte, if you will. If they want a storyteller to come, then I can bring a storyteller with me. If they want any of those things demonstrated, cooking, brick making, blacksmithing, then I can bring those folks with me. And I got some very good folks that could do this. The gentleman with his back to us, that's Jerome Bias. He does cooking demonstrations. He also does period furniture making also. Some players there to the right, the gentleman there in the middle, that's Don Tavius William. The young lady to the left, that's Nicole Moore. She's on the board of directors for the Slave Dwelling Project. The young lady on the right, that's Carolyn Evans, and she does a great Harriet Tubman. That living historian right there, that's Cheney McKnight. Some of you should Google some of these folks. Cheney McKnight, she's got her Her gig is called Not Your Mama's History, MOMMAS, Not Your Mama's History. Real stuff she brings. The gentleman to the right, that's Dontavius Williams, The Chronicles of Adam. Google these folks. You'll be amazed at the ability of these folks. And that, again, I can't do what they do. I don't even try to do it. I stay in my lane, and I honor the enslaved ancestors in the manner that I do. Let's see, are there any more? We got more. Gilbert Walker, there to the left. He's our blacksmith from Savannah, Georgia. I get to hang out with Gilbert. I think in about 2 months I go to the Telfair Museum in Savannah, Georgia. The gentleman there to the right, Rodney Prelo, he and I used to be employed by the National Park Service together. He does brick making demonstration, have a beautiful time showing people how bricks were made during that period in our history. If you visit Charleston, South Carolina, you see those nice, beautiful antebellum buildings that are made of bricks in the city of Charleston. They were made by enslaved people. If you visit Fort Sumter, 13 million bricks that made that site, made by enslaved people. And it's kind of interesting, you know, the same bricks that they made was used for and against their effort to be free. Because, you know, when Fort Sumter was built, that was a United States fort defense system. And they built Fort Sumter because, you know, during the War of 1812, the British marched up the streets of Washington, D.C. and burned our capital. So to prevent something like that from happening again, they built these series of forts along the coast, the East Coast, along the Gulf. And Fort Sumter was a part of that defense system. We don't have too many more slides here. Let me see what we got here. Oh, telltale signs. Fingerprints in the bricks. A lot of folks, they think I'm a little strange because I look for fingerprints in bricks. But we got to look for those telltale signs of the existence of our enslaved ancestors, because there's too many places out there that want to deny the existence of these places. We don't want to get to that place where, you know, today we have some people denying that there was a Holocaust. We don't want to get to a place where people deny that slavery existed in these United States, that in all this greatness that we obtained as a nation, you know, we committed some atrocities along the way. And this is one of those atrocities. You know, we don't want to go back to that place where children have to sit in class and be taught lies. You know, we got primary sources now to prove otherwise. You know, again, those letters that we talked about, these fingerprints in the bricks, those marks on those beams in those nice, beautiful, architecturally significant houses. We got that. We know how to read those things now. And then, you know, it's not like when they were doing the research, the interviews for people who were formerly enslaved in those things, those publications that's now called the slave narrative. You know, we're not restricted in our emotions, our lifestyles, where we can't challenge what's taught to us. And now we challenge what's taught to us. And people with my DNA are telling our stories, and because we have the evidence to do that. And there is some of that evidence. So, urban slavery, you know, I'm now putting these places into categories. I think I've got so many stays in the portfolio now that I could put these places into categories. You know, I spoke earlier about, well, all that I was missing because what I was and was not taught. I was missing all this element of slavery. This place here on the left, that's the Aiken Red House in Charleston, South Carolina. There was a governor, William Aiken. He was probably the largest enslaver in the state of South Carolina. He owned several plantations. One was on a place called Johasi, on Johasi Island, and he enslaved thousands of people there. In fact, I came across a document of reparations, but it was him seeking reparations for the loss of his property. When slavery ended in Washington, D.C., reparations were paid to the owners for loss of property. Same within England. When slavery ended in England, reparations were paid to the owners for loss of property. So that's the Aiken Red House. To the right there is the Hayward Washington House. Now they put Washington on there because when Washington was visited Charleston, South Carolina, I think he may have spent one night in that place. One night. So now his name is on that place. So I got this idea, right? I said, Washington slept there. I slept in more places than Washington. That's historic. Now, I'm going to go on this campaign to put my name on some of these buildings, because I slept in a lot of these historic places. And an amazing thing about these two particular sites, when we were stricken, when COVID came about, I had to call on these places again because leading up to COVID, people would stand in line for this opportunity to spend the night in these places. Then COVID came and all that had to cease. So I said, look, William Aiken House, look, Hayward Washington House, I need your assistance. I need access to your site. Because if I could still sleep in these places all by myself and use the technology that exists, Facebook Live, Zoom, then I could still let the public know that it's still necessary to teach real history. Because we don't want to go back to that place where this history is forgotten or so minimized that it doesn't matter. And they gave me access. They gave me access. They didn't even ask the question. They said, Joe, yes, come on, you're going to have the space. And you could come in and you could do what's necessary to maintain your contact with your audience. Not only did it work, the audience for the Slave Dwelling Project grew immensely. And now those folks are still in support of the Slave Dwelling Project. I think we're near the end. Oh, we got more. There it is. Urban slavery, still on urban slavery. Right there to the left. That's that place in New Orleans where that fight almost broke out. I told you there was alcohol involved. So that's the Beauregard Kai's house. Beauregard, it's interesting because it's Beauregard. PGT Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He ordered the first shot of the Civil War shot on the Fort Sumter. So at 4:30 a.m., the first shot of the Civil War was fired from Fort Johnson at April 12th at 4:30 a.m. They shoot that first shot. That shot sails a mile and a third. That 10-inch mortar shell sails a mile and a third over the harbor, explodes directly over Fort Sumter. That was a signal shot for 43 other guns cordoned around Fort Sumter to start firing. That battle went on for 40-something or so hours, but there were no casualties. But the point is, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard ordered that first shot. So this is the Beauregard Kai's house. So I was interested in staying there because of his association with Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. But then I did some research on the builder of the house. And I found out that this gentleman was an auctioneer. And you know what he was auctioning? People. People who I share DNA with. So I found that even more interesting than PGT Beauregard. So I had the pleasure of spending a night in that place. The place to the right there, that's the Hugh Craft House. That's in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Interesting because the owners, well, the former owners of that house, they just within the last year sold it. When they bought that house about 11 years ago, the Slave Dwelling Project was in its infancy. So the two owners, relatively young folks, they, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, they have this thing called the pilgrimage. It's very prominent in Natchez. Mississippi just has this thing about this thing called a pilgrimage. What they do is they allow access to these nice, beautiful antebellum buildings. And of course, what they concentrate on is that kind of Gone with the Wind, hoop skirt, mint julep kind of story. But these young owners said, wait a minute. Why should the story stop there at the back door of the big house? Why not take the story into these slave dwellings? We know this young guy, my coworker, who just started this project called the Slave Dwelling Project. Maybe we should call him to help us interpret these spaces. And they called me, and now for the past 10 years, I've been going to Holly Springs, Mississippi to interpret this space. Now, again, they just sold the place this year, and I thought my presence there was over. I thought my work there was done. But then I got this email just last week saying, hey, you need to pick your date for next year. We got to figure out what date's going to work for us. And not only that, we also formed this partnership with the University of Mississippi. They own the gentleman, the William Faulkner House in Oxford, Mississippi. So I go to participate in this event that we call the Behind the Big House tour, right? So they give me a tour of William Faulkner's house. And the young person in charge, we make these arrangements for the second year that I come. I was going to stay in the William Faulkner house. Then I added an extra day to my trip that second year, and leading up, a few days before I went there, I learned that, no, you're not going to be staying in the William Faulkner house. That's because the higher-ups, the folks associated with the University of Mississippi, didn't want to go there. They weren't ready. They wanted that place to be about William Faulkner and William Faulkner only. The slavery that went on there, no, we're not interpreting that. You keep that over there where it belongs. But the last few times I've gone to Mississippi, it has been in conjunction with the University of Mississippi, and they finally came around and started doing the right thing. Okay, so yeah, that's the last slide right there. So what are we doing now? So in our evolution, you saw some of the things that we are currently doing. What was not up there was the fact that we have conferences. This 2 weeks ago, we had our 7th conference for the Slave Dwelling Project. We concentrated on rebellion, resistance, and resilience. We called the conference the Stoner Rebellion in the Atlantic World. And we had a great time, a great turnout, a great audience dealing with matters of rebellion, resistance, and resilience. A lot of people walked away from that conference asking, well, when will be the next conference? We're so excited you guys pulled this off. When is the next conference? Well, I can't answer that question yet. Because, the Slave Dwelling Project, we're in a place right now, we are successful in what we do, but we got to figure out where we go from here. I just had a birthday. I turned 61. So I got to start thinking, I want to ride off into the sunset too, and we got to figure out, well, how are we going to be able for me to ride off into the sunset and still have this project, Slave Dwelling Project, still persist, still go on. Because everybody wants to leave a legacy. I think everybody should want to leave a legacy, and you want to be remembered for something positive. And when you get to wherever you're going, I don't know where that might be for you, but I want to be acknowledged by the ancestors as doing something good, especially doing something good for them, to make sure that I gave them the voice that they didn't have when they were here on this earth. And I think the Slave Dwelling Project is being successful in doing just that. And that's proven by my presence here when I get the invitation by folks in the know, folks who want, who think like me and see the relevance of such a presence, to get me in front of audiences like this, and ensure that the voices of the enslaved ancestors is always heard. So I want to thank you for the invitation, And I'm going to yield to you right now to see where we go from here. Questions and answers, or are we done?
We have 2 microphones, one on each side for questions for Joe. So if you raise your hand, Dr. Bellamy or Dr. Knott can bring you a microphone.
I got one request. Is there a bottled water nearby anywhere? Love you for that. Ancestors loved you for that. Love you for that. Okay, now's your turn. Now's your turn. Yeah, we got a hand right here. He's going to bring you a microphone.
So I know that earlier when I met you during like 11 a.m. you talked about like the conditions. Was there like one specific like instance where you're staying in a slave dwelling that like opened up your mind, whether that was negatively or positively?
Yeah, I got lots of instances. Is that the one what I relayed, the Texas incident, or was it some?
Yes.
Oh yeah, Texas. Anybody here from Texas? Okay, I don't see any hands. But when I was in Texas, I stayed at a place called Seward Plantation in Brenham, Texas. And I had the opportunity to stand on an authentic auction block and thought about people standing on auction blocks, having to bare their backs to the potential buyer to show that potential buyer that there are no marks on his or her back, because that's a sign of a defiant enslaved person. And no enslaver wants to buy a defiant enslaved person to give them thoughts of being defiant and, you know, going against this system that enslaved them. How many of you saw the movie Glory? That's, you know, with Denzel Washington? Okay, yeah. For those of you who saw that movie, you saw the scene where he was whipped, and before he got whipped, he kind of whipped his shirt off, and you saw the marks on his back, and they started to whip him, and you saw that one tear fall. I think that's that tear that got him that award. What do you win for movies? Oscars?
Academy Awards.
Well,
Academy Awards.
whatever that award he got for that movie, or what they do for big screen movies, he got that award. And people say it was that tear, the marks on his back that really got him that award. But he played the role well. So yeah, that was certainly one instance. And you know, as I categorize these places, you know, I think every stay at these presidential sites is quite substantial. All these stays at these institutions of higher learning, quite substantial, quite memorable. So all those are memorable moments.
Iowans even especially have a heritage area, the Missouri's Little Dixie Heritage Area, the 4 counties in Missouri along the Missouri River, starting at the northwest with Clay County, which Liberty, just north of Kansas City, is the county seat of Clay County. And I was wondering if you have any acquaintance with the Missouri's Little Dixie Heritage Area. It was a hemp culture, and 25% of the people living in those 4 counties were enslaved African Americans. There's only one other county in Missouri, way down by the Boot Heel, that had 25% of the people living in that county were enslaved African Americans. Have you heard much about the Missouri's Little Dixie Heritage Area?
Yeah. Do you know Gary Finfausen? Do you know Gary Finfausen?
No.
The answer is yes. I have stayed in slave dwellings in Missouri, Little Dixie. In fact, I was given a presentation there, and you know, they did the advertising for the fact that I was coming to give a presentation, and I guess the guy who saw the advertisement thought it was about Dixie, because he was sitting right there in the front row with his Confederate hat on, Confederate emblem on his hat. And I'm there giving this presentation. But I've stayed in Lexington, I've stayed at Pilot Grove, St. Genevieve, but in Little Dixie itself, I've stayed in places there, and it's because about 2 years into the project, when I was still with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, I get this call from Mr. Gary Finfausen. He was the voice of Little Dixie in Missouri. And in his letter, he said, Mr. McGill, I see what you're doing. It has relevance. I would like for you to come to Missouri because I'm a white man trying to do what you're doing. And I think if you come here, it'll give this project more relevance. And at the time that he made that request, I said, look, you know, I'm only staying in the state of South Carolina because that's where my limited resources will take me. I said, if you want me to come to Missouri, you're going to have to provide the resources for that to happen. He said, well, let's step out on faith. I'll put in for this grant from the Humanities Council of Missouri. And so we put it on the calendar. And about 2 weeks before I was supposed to go there, I get the call. He said, it's funded. Come on over. And so, yeah, that's how I got to Little Dixie in Missouri. The amazing thing about Missouri is, you know, Missouri in the Civil War didn't commit, it was a kind of a border state. It didn't commit one way or the other to the Civil War. But they sent more people to serve for the Confederacy than they sent to serve for the Union. So it was literally brother against brother in the state of Missouri.
And Kentucky.
Yeah, Kentucky, yeah, another state that didn't commit one way or the other. And then there was Kansas that kind of entered the Union during the Civil War. I stayed at places in Kansas also. Bleeding Kansas. Yeah. Questions?
Give me a second, Jesse.
Okay. Yeah, you got to be careful coming down those steps.
Yeah, it's like a lot of little stuff. I almost filmed myself coming in here. I'm from Arkansas, so I ask, have you been anywhere in Arkansas? And if so, tell me about it.
Yeah, Arkansas. Arkansas, I went to, where have I gone in Arkansas? I've gone to Arkansas, Little Rock, that's the capital. Yeah, in Little Rock there's a place, there's the Arkansas Museum. There's a place that historians call architectural petting zoos, meaning that buildings were moved to a place from somewhere they were historically to where they are now, and it's just a series of buildings. So right in the city, in Little Rock, is this place. I stayed in a slave dwelling there, and there's a place on the Mississippi, a place called Lakeview. No. Anyway, I stayed at a place there. And we did a cooking demonstration. It was a challenge to do that cooking demonstration because the wind coming off of that Mississippi River was something else. So the gentleman doing the cooking, he was so challenged that the wind, he did a cake, and where the wind was coming from, that side of the cake was well done, and in fact burned, and the other side of the cake was still kind of raw. So yeah, we stayed at those two places. I'm going back again in December to a place whose name I can't recall right now, but as I continue to talk to you, I can probably bring it up and let you know where that place is going to be if I can find my calendar. So in December, I will be going to, if it's on here, place called Hollywood Plantation. Oh, thank you. I would hug you if I could. A place called Hollywood Plantation. Does that ring a bell? Anyway, that's where I'll be going in Arkansas. The Saturday is December 3rd, so it's December 2nd and 3rd. I'll be going to Hollywood Plantation in Arkansas.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, way up there.
Sure.
That's going to be a challenge. Why don't you throw it up there?
So, like, there are a lot of things that people could find, like going to all these slave dwellings and things like that. For example, the things I might see going to different places, my perspective might be different from yours, but I just want to know, like, what stood out to you in all this way, like slave dwellings, because probably for someone who's done the research and going to a lot of places, what I might see will be different from what you see. So I just really wanted to know, from your standpoint, like, what was something that stood out to you when you went to those different places?
That they're the same but different. Same in the sense that it was slavery, no matter where in these United States you were, whether it's a northern state, southern state, it was, it was still slavery. But the difference is the architecture. They used in these buildings what was available to them to build these buildings. Usually the first generation of a slave cabin is a log cabin, a log building. But most of these plantations were around for more than 1, 2, 3 generations of the same family. Or, if not the same family, they were still plantation, maybe sold to someone else. And a lot of these places managed to evolve. Eventually, they started out as log cabins. Maybe they evolved into milled wood. But some of these places, when they were built initially, using material that they used at the time was so substantial, such as the cases of the coastline of Florida, Georgia, southern South Carolina. You got the tabbies. And tabbies, that's long-lasting material. That's a Spanish-influenced material. So a lot of those structures were built of that material. You go to a place like Texas, so a lot of these buildings were built of stone. Some in Virginia, you get field stones. When enslaved people were clearing these fields to grow tobacco, whatever that they were growing in these fields, they didn't throw away that stone. They used that stone to build cabins, build a big house in some cases. And something else that's quite common is a lot of these homes for enslaved people, for the field hands, were duplexes. They got the chimney in the middle, a partition down the middle, but that same chimney heats both sides. So these enslavers are being efficient in housing these enslaved people. Another thing that is common is this: if it's a slave cabin near the big house, it's usually built of the same material that the big house is built of, because it's near the big house. And these enslavers are flaunting their wealth. They aren't treating the enslaved people inside these spaces any better, but they're flaunting their wealth. Another thing that I find in common is this. A lot of people visiting these sites want to know if that particular site that they're visiting, they want to know if that particular slave owner was good to their enslaved people. That's a very common question asked by a lot of people who visit plantations. So, if they ask that question to you at the site you're working at, they ask that same question to every interpreter at every site that they go. How is it in their minds that they think that enslavers were good to their people? How is it in their mind that they can think that these enslaved people were happy giving up their labor and not reaping the benefits of their labor? How is it in their mind that they think that these men of that period were happy being emasculated and not being the father that system, the privileges or the rights that that system took away from them to be the father that they could have been? How is it in their mind that people think that it's okay to go to a plantation and have a wedding? Because of that education that we receive. So those are those revelations that I've come across in this journey that I've been on. There's some more things. I mean, I could talk about some more things, but I want to give other folks. And see, our host is standing up now, though that's an indication of something we need to do right now.
Rachel says 2 more questions, but I say there are cookies and punch in the atrium that are calling our names, but Joe would be happy to answer any questions that you have before he has the cookie and punch. And could we thank him again for being here?